Composting methods include outdoor and indoor methods. The first one we're going to talk about is indoor composting methods, worm composting and bulkish ferment composting. Worm composting, also known as vermicomposting. Feed compostable food scraps, yard trimmings, and other organic matter to worms to create compost. The process for this is to place worm composting box, purchased or DIY, inside anywhere that is easily accessible for you and you feel comfortable with it being there. Use a small container to collect scraps. This container is separate from your composting box. Use a trowel to dig holes and bury compostable materials in dirt and moist paper. Remove scraps that have not been eaten by the worms. In a timely manner, you'll notice that the other materials have been eaten, but some have left by the worms. Sometimes they just won't eat some of the products. Replace the lid. Wash the food scrap container. Keep it nice and clean for new food scraps, and repeat this process weekly. When it comes time to harvest, a couple of weeks before, you want to feed the worms on the same side of the compost bin to encourage them to move to one side. Harvest compost from the opposite side of the feeding side carefully with a trowel. Use harvested compost in the yard, flower bed, garden, or potted plants to fertilize. The tools needed for worm composting. A purchased compost bin designed for worm composting. If you would like to do a DIY worm composter, there's a link right here. Shredded paper, not colored, not glossy, soaked in water and drained. It should be enough to fill about 3 inches of the bottom of your container and feed worms once a week. You need a pound of red wigglers composting worms. That's about 800 to 1,000 worms. And a trowel to move compost as needed. A container for food scrap. The pros of worm composting is it is perfect for small indoor spaces. Harvested compost helps seeds germinate faster and protects plants from pests. The cons of worm composting is worms can be sensitive to changes in the climate. You can only compost about 1 inch of food scraps at once a week. It's not a good idea to add onions or garlic to the indoor compost because it can create smells. This option would be best for someone with a small space that would like a finished composted material to add to soil around plants. Our second option, kashi composting. This is really a fermentation process rather than composting. It is considered, they do discuss it when we talk about composting. It relies on a kashi brand to ferment food scraps, including meat or dairy, unlike some other composting methods, into a nutrient-rich soil builder and liquid fertilizer. The process is to add a couple of spoonfuls of kashi to the bottom of the bucket. Add scraps that are cut into about 1-inch pieces to prevent air pockets and to increase the speed of decomposition. Do not add food that has green or black mold or deep frying oil, an excessive amount of oil at all. Sprinkle kashi on top of the scraps. Press mixture down using a potato masher. Place plate on top of the scraps to keep the air out. Repeat until the bucket is full. Allow full bucket to sit undisturbed for a couple of weeks. While the bucket is sitting undisturbed for a couple of weeks, you begin to harvest its products. To start the harvest process, Draw liquid off of the undisturbed kashi mixture every other day. Liquid can be heavily diluted with water and used as a fertilizer. After 10 to 14 days, bury in a hole or trench about 8 to 12 inches deep away from plants, or bury in the compost pile. If land is not available, bury it in a 25-gallon planter with 4 parts dirt and 1 part bokashi mixture. Materials for bokashi composting. You will need a bokashi brand. Purchased or homemade. Homemade recipe is linked here. Buckets, 5-gallon with easy to remove lids and a small drain to remove liquid as it is created. A dinner sized plate is used to prevent protected fermented material from air when adding scraps. Apartment dwellers may need a 25-gallon planter for burying bokashi materials. The pros of bokashi composting. Can compost meat and dairy. Can be used as the first step to outdoor compost piles to reduce the time before the composted product. Least expensive method. Container can be stored inside. The cons of bokashi composting. The completed product cannot be used immediately on soil for plants. A large outside area is needed to bury the completed product. This option would be best for someone with a large yard or a compost pile to bury the final product. The quick summary for indoor composting options. Worm composting is a good choice for apartment dwellers. Bokashi composting is done in a container inside, but to dispose of the finished product, ground or a large planter is needed.